Hello, everybody. I'm Anthony Gonzalez, and I'm the program coordinator with the Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse Prevention and Recovery. And I want to welcome you all today to our webinar titled Social Norms Marketing Campaigns, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, presented by Dr. Bill DeJong. Before we get started, I do have just a couple of housekeeping slides I'd like to share with everybody. Here on the screen should look somewhat familiar as we are in the Zoom webinar format. We do have the chat and Q&A enabled. We do ask that if you have specific questions today for our presenter to please utilize the Q&A box, but feel free to introduce who you are and where you're joining us from, along with resources and reflection on today's content. But again, if you have specific questions for our presenter, please utilize the Q&A box. Additionally, we have live captioning enabled for today's session, and you can turn that on through your bottom dashboard. If you have any issues getting that set up, please just send me a chat and I'll be happy to walk you through that process. We'd encourage everybody to learn more about becoming a member of the Higher Education Center. You can learn more about the different membership tiers and the benefits that go along with them by visiting our website at hecaod.osu.edu. Additionally, we have a few upcoming events I'd like to share with you. We have our June water cooler chat happening on June 13th and is titled What's Trending, Responding, Following, and Monitoring Trends in Collegiate AOD. The following day on June 14th, we have our June webinar and is titled From Proposals to Programming, a How-To Guide for Writing Effective Learning Outcomes. And we have the national meeting just about a month out, which will be taking place in person in Columbus, Ohio, June 25th through the 28th, and we do have virtual options available. So we do encourage you check out the conference website to learn more. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Bill DeJong, retired professor from Boston University School of Public Health, adjunct professor with Tufts Medical School, vice president of research and evaluation, Impairment Science, Inc., and advisor for the National Social Norms Center out of Michigan State University. It's my pleasure turning it over to you at this time.
All right. Oh no. What happened to my beautiful slideshow that I queued up? Okay. Grandpa will be here with you all in just a moment. Had everything lined up and then it disappeared. Okay, there we go. My stage name is William, but please do call me Bill, as Anthony just did. I first want to acknowledge the several collaborators that I've had over the years in social norms work. You see them listed there. And
Bill, you still need to share your slides. I'm sorry to jump in.
I'm sorry, what?
We're not seeing the slide deck. You'll just need to share your screen.
I thought I had. Okay. Oh boy. Sorry. Well, at my end, it thinks it's sharing. Oh, here we go. Never mind. Good Lord. Can you see this now?
I don't see them, but I can share them from my screen and advance them if that's easier.
I wonder why it worked in the.
Of course, yeah. I can go ahead and share the slides. You can just let me know when to advance.
Please do. We had everything queued up and then here we are. Okay. So I was saying that there are several people I've worked with over the years, researchers and public health practitioners who have taught me a lot about the social norms approach, and I see them listed there. And I think we have to acknowledge, especially Alan Berkowitz and Wes Perkins, who essentially set this whole approach in motion with their seminal article there from the 1980s. The literature on social norms approaches generally has just exploded. Of course, a lot of the early work was focused on college student drinking, and that's what we'll be talking about now. So go to the next slide. So we're going to be looking at some past campaigns, and along the line, I'll be highlighting some guidelines. First, start with defining social norms, explaining the two types of social norms, a review for most of you. Look at behavior change theory and how a focus on social norms fits into that. We'll examine one set of data that demonstrates the misperceptions of the norms, and then we'll get into some thinking about the intervention strategy and in particular social norms campaigns. And then design principles and challenges. So on to the next one. So I always enjoy quoting my son, Will, who is now 29, but at the age of 4, he said, you know, Dad, you can learn a lot by watching other people. And I realized that he had just encapsulated Albert Bandura's entire career in that statement at the age of 4. And that's certainly an important part of the social norms approach, because we do watch other people to ascertain what the norms are, what we should be doing ourselves. And, you know, I think that it's an amazing insight from a 4-year-old. Okay, on to the next one. Okay, so we differentiate between two types of norms. Descriptive norms are just basically our sense of what most members of a group or community or society do in a particular social context. So descriptive norms describe how people behave. Now, it can include behaviors that people do not do as well. That can be part of the normative package. And then, of course, injunctive norms are about what people should be doing. So these norms prescribe how people should behave. And it all is grounded in what people accept as normal and therefore expect of other people. Next slide. Okay, so perceptions of social norms are an important part of different behavior change theories, especially the theory of planned behavior. There are any number of things that need to be in place for behavior to change. Social norms, changing perceptions of social norms is one of the most critical. And of course, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that as we use social norms information to change people's behavior, that's going to feed back into their perceptions of the social norms. And that has a number of implications for the design, namely keeping up with the shifts in the norms so that you can adjust your messaging as you go along. Next slide. Okay, so as I just said, people's perceptions of social norms are a good predictor of what people think, say, and do, but they can be grossly inaccurate. But even so, they'll be influential. And many of my colleagues in the field came to say that people are conforming to imaginary peers. They have the sense of what people are doing. It's inaccurate, but they find themselves feeling pressure to conform to that perception nonetheless. Next slide. So this is a survey I did a few years ago involving 18 different institutions of higher education. So there was one question in the survey that asked them about a number of drinking related behaviors. This particular one asked them on how many occasions they used, and it listed various substances. One of them, of course, was alcohol. There was a companion question during the past 30 days on how many occasions do you think the average or typical student at this school has used alcohol. We'll go on to the next slide. So we're very interested in the contrast between what people think is the case and what is actually the case. And so you can see on the x-axis the different response alternatives ranging from never to 40 or more times. Of course, one of the most striking things is that at the lower end, never and 1 to 2 times in 30 days, that is, in fact, a majority of the students who responded to the survey, but you can see the perceptions are nowhere near that. Now, I will say, going into that particular study years ago, we weren't really sure exactly how the misperceptions would manifest themselves. But going forward, seeing this data, I would ask a different question. In addition to asking about their own behavior, what percentage of students at your college drank on 0, 1, or 2 occasions during the past 30 days? So in fact, it is a majority, as you can see, and you can have a direct comparison between the percentage of students who are drinking at those lower levels and then the percentage of people who think that the typical student is drinking at that level. Next. Yeah, just go ahead and populate the whole thing. Okay, so in the literature, you're going to find documented overestimations for alcohol use on a number of different measures, risky and dangerous drinking, driving under the influence, and parents' acceptance of underage alcohol use. And I mention that because there has been some work in the field trying to encourage parents to have conversations with their incoming freshman students. And parents sometimes feel uneasy about that because they don't think most parents are going to do that. They don't want to be different. And then, you know, as a matter of social influence, the students themselves might misperceive how their parents are actually thinking about this. But by the same token, if you look at the positive side, there are documented underestimations. Students tend to underestimate what percentage of other students are bothered by secondhand effects. And by that, we mean the impact of heavy drinking on other students in terms of damage, property, injuries, disturbed sleep, or whatever. We find that students underestimate the willingness of others to intervene to confront abusive drinking or prevent alcohol-related harms. And we see underestimations in support for stricter policies and enforcement. You'll see later that students are in favor of things that other students and even administrators would never imagine. So these alcohol-related misperceptions end up encouraging greater alcohol use by drinkers, earlier initiation by non-drinkers, and it allows problem drinkers to justify their behavior, and therefore it encourages them to keep doing what they're doing. It can also inhibit bystanders from intervening, and it can discourage college administrators from putting in and enforcing stricter policies. Next slide. Okay, so basic assumptions of the social norms approach is that healthy behavior, underestimated, unhealthy behavior, overestimated. And one of the reasons that this happens is that problem behaviors are more salient. You know, if a student is walking past the school library, which is across from a fraternity house, he might see a fraternity member who's been drinking, you know, been at the fraternity meeting midweek and is throwing up in the bushes. That's memorable, it's salient. And that will come to mind if that student was asked to estimate what percentage of students are drinking heavily. What you may not notice is that in the library, in this huge study room, there are several hundred people cramming for midterms. Not aware of that. So these problem behaviors are more salient, they get more attention, they're more memorable, and that influences the perceptions. I said before that these misperceptions can inhibit a healthy majority from acting in healthy ways. They think they're all alone. When I supervised a new version of alcohol EDU a few years ago, I just infused it with social norms thinking. And we asked students for feedback, of course, on the course. And one of the questions we asked them was, what was the most important thing you learned? And the modal response was, I thought everybody was drinking heavily. I'm so relieved to know that's not the case. Because they felt that they'll find their people and they'll be just fine in this new environment. Same token, these misperceptions can take your problem drinkers and it encourages them to act out because they think their behavior is normative. The fact is, if we think about all the different ways that we have to try to change behavior, perceptions of social norms can be easier to change than a lot of the other determinants of health behavior, especially environmental determinants. But this all depends on correctly implementing the approach and addressing some of the common challenges that you face. Next slide. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to point out here is that the social norms approach is actually woven into screening and brief intervention programs like BASICS and Electronic Checkup to Go, and the program that Ohio State has, the name of which I'm blanking on at the moment. It can be part of alcohol prevention courses, as is the case with alcohol EDU. There are group norm interventions, working primarily with athletes and fraternity and sorority members. But then there are the campus-wide social norms marketing campaigns, which is what I'm going to focus on. Next. Okay, so essentially what this approach involves is changing people's beliefs about which behaviors are the norm. But for many students, it will be reinforcing those beliefs. And that's something that needs to be remembered. You'll see later that I will say that you really want to focus on where the misperceptions are. But it can be important to also have messages that simply reinforce what the majority already believes. So this is just a matter of providing accurate facts about what most members of a social group are doing and communicating which behaviors are approved by most members of a social group. Essential to this approach is making sure that people will actually be motivated to act on this information. You have to present this data in a context where they will understand that the data should be trusted. You have to take steps to encourage them to identify with the comparison group. And by comparison group, I mean their peers, as identified in the message. But also important, you want to avoid directive messaging that triggers reactions. You don't want to come out and say, the majority is doing this, and therefore this is what you must do. That part is implicit. It's left for them to think about that and make their own decision about. But any directive messaging, especially for this age cohort, is just not going to work. Next slide. Okay, so the basic idea, campus campaign, use media communications to report accurate norms. This should lead to a decrease in perceived normative expectations. We do derive a sense of what we think other people approve of and expect of us based on what we observe, based on the descriptive norms. And then this should lead to a decrease in alcohol consumption and its negative consequences. So that's a stripped down logic model. Now let's look at the full one on the next slide. So when I develop a logic model, I do try to go into as much detail as possible. In the leftmost column, you're going to see the kinds of program resources that are needed. There can be process evaluation objectives identified for all those. Then you have your program activities. And you can see that, it's the media campaign itself. There might be group meetings with these groups that don't necessarily identify with all students, classroom work, and then press work as well. And the campaign, in order to work, has to be credible. The materials have to be attention-getting, attractive, and memorable. Now, what I want to point out is the middle column, which is really what you're trying to achieve with this campaign. First and foremost, you need to make sure that they're aware of the message. One of the things I found in working at the University of Rhode Island is that we were doing a campaign campus-wide for several weeks, and it was such an elaborate campaign, so many different communication channels used. I mean, everything short of skywriting above the campus. And it turned out that a third of the students had never heard of the campaign. So you can't assume that just because you're pumping out all of this material that people are aware of it. They have to accept it. The believability of the message is not something that you can take for granted. This should then result in changes in the estimate of other students' alcohol consumption and reduced perception of pressure to drink. And then the rest of the outcomes follow from that, leading to improved health and quality of life, which you can review later. Also listed some other change objectives, because this kind of campaign is going to work better if there are other things being done in the way of programming, especially programming that will change the environment in which students are making decisions about their alcohol use. Next slide. Did it one more? There we go. So for a campus-wide campaign, the general guidelines are that the message should be targeted to the entire undergraduate population. And you are, of course, conveying information about the normative behavior, what a majority of students are doing. It should correct a misperception held by a majority of students. And as I said before, it's just a simple statement of fact. You avoid a judgmental or moralistic tone, and you do not tell students what they should be doing. You simply present information about what most students are doing. Bottom part of the slide got cut off, and simply saying that the message choice should be based on the strength of the norm, but also the magnitude of the misperception. Next slide. Okay, so these campaigns using posters and other materials of that ilk have a straightforward normative message. Point out this is an early campaign from the University of Arizona, which has become the model for so many campaigns, as well as Northern Illinois University and Western Washington University, and Hobart and Smith colleges, where Alan Berkowitz and Wes Perkins worked. So you see the message most U of A students have 4 or fewer drinks when they party. So that is information that came from a survey. That is your normative message. And it's important to give the exact percentage. And you have to think about what message you're going to use based on your data, because if it's 52%, well, that feels like 50-50. It doesn't really feel like a norm. If you present data that 85% or 90% of students are doing something, that strains credulity. And so there's kind of a sweet spot between like 65 and 80, where it's clearly a majority norm. There's going to be misperceptions, but it's not such a small majority or such a large majority that the effectiveness of the campaign is impacted. Now, in this early campaign, they said 4 or fewer drinks. And the problem with that is that the number 4 just screams out at you. And you'll see in later messaging that it's better to say that most students have 0 to 4 or 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 drinks when they party. One of the questions that always comes up, well, what was a drink? What did students think was a drink when they filled out this survey? Are we talking, a glass slipper? Are we talking about a fishing boot? I mean, what's a drink? And so the survey did present what a standard drink was, at least for beer, wine, and spirits, and that's presented. You can see the logo in the lower left corner, Campus Health, which actually is a credible source of information on that campus. And it mentions the survey from which this data was taken, highlighting the fact that it was a randomly selected group. Now, one of the things you will notice is that the response rate is not reported. And it's typical in college student surveys, even putting in the most strenuous effort you can imagine to get a higher response rate. You get no more than 50%, and that is if you're doing really well. Response rates in the 30s are very typical. Next slide.
Bill, before you go on, I had a question come in that's pertinent. You touched on it a little bit, but about percentages. And so if percentages are over 80 or almost 50, can you reiterate what you said there? So we had a question come in, and I thought it was really good info. If you could reiterate about that.
Sure. My point was that you're looking at majority behaviors, but if it's barely a majority, a number in the 50s, it's very easy to people to say, well, that's not really everybody. I mean, that's not a majority, really. I mean, that's a lot of people who aren't doing this. And so it just loses its persuasiveness. And we know this from pre-testing that we did working with several schools in a study. By the same token, we found that if their data happened to show that a particular alcohol-related behavior was practiced by 80, 90%, over 80, I should say, to 90% or more, people didn't believe it, because these misperceptions are so entrenched that if you hit them with something that is so far away from what they've been thinking, they're just going to question whether it's accurate or not. Are there any other questions that I need to take a moment to address?
I think the one, this may work with where we're at, but it's if we don't have data on student AOD use, would you recommend using data available from the city or the state level?
No. That's a great question. If you have information that convinces you that the students on your campus identify with all college students in the city or all college students in the state, then I guess you could do it. But the fact is that's it's unlikely that very many students would identify with college students more generally. It's always been argued that you want to have data from your campus because most students identify with being part of that student body, and therefore they see this information as relevant to them. That's kind of what I used to hear from campus administrators when trying to promote what I called environmental management strategies. And very often the refrain from an administrator was, well, our campus is unique. And I was like, okay, yes, every campus is unique. Well, it just means in this case that students are less likely to see data about a very large group outside of their own campus as being relevant to them. Anything else, Anthony? Or is this Logan?
Yeah, this is Logan. Nope, nothing right
Okay.
now.
Okay, very good. So one of the things that's important about these campaigns to keep in mind is that on a college campus, there's a whole range of communication channels, and I haven't even listed them all here. Many of them don't cost you anything. One of the things we did at the University of Rhode Island, we were sending out email messages periodically. And the thing was that the essence of the message was in the title of the email. So even if they wanted to just delete it, they would at least see the main message there. And you might think, well, students are going to get sick of getting all these messages. And we gave students the option of asking to be taken off the distribution list. And in fact, I think it was less than 10 students asked us to do that. And this is a campus of several thousand. It's important that they see these messages in a variety of places because the frequency with which they're presented with this information is very, very important, which I'll talk about a bit more later. Next slide. I'm going to call out this campaign from San Diego State University. It is both bad and it is ugly. John Clapp, who was the final director of the Higher Ed Center when it was funded by the Department of Education, and the first director of the Higher Education Center based at the Ohio State University, worked with me and a colleague at San Diego State to analyze why this Done For campaign had failed. And if you're interested in reading the article, you can see it there. But let's take a look at this beauty. It was primarily a poster campaign. And one of the things to understand is that this campaign message was based on a UCLA campaign that was developed by an advertising company. And it's just horribly wrong. One of the things ad agencies love to put in PSAs of this sort is a pun. And bottoms up, well, that's what we say if we're drinking, bottoms up. And of course, it immediately makes us think about this guy bending over the toilet. Done for. Well, I guess that's supposed to refer to the social norms message, which you see in small print. Over 3/4 of SDSU students drink 4 or fewer drinks when they party. And it's a student survey. Well, done for is also an expression we use that when you've just reached your limit or gone past your limit, you're done for. And I've always noticed all these bottles and cans, but getting ready for this talk was the first time I actually counted them, and there are 10. And then there's a pizza box. And I'm thinking, who drinks and eats in a restroom? I mean, this is just bizarre. Now, what we did in that study is that there was a marketing class at San Diego State. And this a slide of this poster, which was the main part of the campaign, was put up on the screen in front of the class for just a few seconds. And then they were asked to report, among other things, what is the message? And of course, the main message they got out of this was, if you drink too much, you might get sick and throw up. So, this is the worst one that I've come across. And if you read the article, and we actually, talk about how you can do that better. If we move on to next slide, there's going to be 3 good campaigns that I want to highlight quickly. One is Michigan State University, another University of Virginia, and then Montana Department of Transportation. So let's jump into Michigan State. This is how they began, and you can see the posters. I've seen better posters. This is the one on the left is just incredibly busy, and the graphics on the one on the right aren't particularly appealing, at least to me. I've put arrows to indicate where the social norms message regarding alcohol is. And one of the strategies that people have tried to increase the credibility of that alcohol message is to embed it in a set of messages about things where you wouldn't question whether this is accurate data. 97% of Michigan State students listen to music to manage stress. Sure. No one's going to say, hey, wait a minute, that can't be right. So when it's presented in this context, it should be more influential. Now you notice that the one on the right says 57%, and this poster on the left was done later, and it says 63%. I would not have advised to use that particular measure in the first one, it being in the 50s, but once it's above 60, it's much better. Okay, so then if we go to the next slide, they had a huge change in direction. So they came up with the ducks concept and completely retooled their campaign. They had been putting ads into the student newspaper, the state news, very expensive. And instead they introduced t-shirts and bookmarks, stickers, games on special duck days. And they used Facebook for the first time. To the extent that you can rely on media that cost virtually nothing, like Facebook or email or text messages or Instagram or any of these other social media sites, you can really get your message out much more cost effectively. Go to the next one. Okay, so all of their campaign messaging since they made this switch has presented the ducks. And there are a couple of reasons that they've done this. Allison Smith says, I love those ducks. Well, Michigan State students do too. It's a very popular campaign. They introduce these characters for a couple of reasons. One is that when you use photographs of students, which was the typical thing to do, and certainly Michigan State did that a lot too, you run the risk of people looking at the people presented and saying, well, that's not me. If you go back to the University of Arizona one, it's like, it's 2 white people. There are lots of Hispanics, lots of African Americans, Native Americans, foreign students who attend that school, but they're not going to identify with the people in that poster necessarily. So using ducks, you're not linking it to a particular type of person. It's also attention getting, and it's fun. And there's, in this case, they're using puns effectively. Keeping count is instrumental. And In other words, keep track of how much you're drinking, and 7 out of 10 students have 0 to 4 drinks when they party. On to the next one. They've used this to promote a lot of different messages. A lot of them are prevention messages and like strategies to moderate your drinking so that you don't have an elevated blood alcohol concentration. You see the one on the left, it's really emphasizing that on a typical Thursday night, which is basically the beginning of the weekend, 75% of students are doing something other than drinking. We'll say a little bit of a tangent. For me, it's a problem that there are so few Friday classes because we've now institutionalized the 3-day weekend on so many campuses. They've used it to promote alternative transportation, designated driver, a safe flight back to your nest. Again, a clever pun that nonetheless gets the message across. Next slide. Okay, so here's one of several diagrams that I could show you, but this one is pretty dramatic. It goes all the way back 2000 through 2021. And back then, the average BAC that students reported, you can see it was like 0.09. And as a matter of reference, I've put the typical description of what different BAC levels mean for reference. And how do they determine this? Well, there are 4 questions that you need to ask. What's the greatest number of standard drinks that you've had on a single drinking occasion in the past 2 weeks, or the past 30 days, whatever is asked? What was the duration of that drinking occasion? Number of hours and minutes? How much do you weigh? Please tell us accurately. And what is your biological sex, not gender? With all due apologies, you always want to explain why you're asking about sex, biological sex rather than gender. And you can see as the campaign proceeded, even before they introduced the ducks, that they were making a lot of progress in seeing less frequent, heavy drinking leading to highly dangerous, highly elevated BACs. And you can see with the graduate students, it dropped all the way down from 0.06 to 0.02, which is just basically getting relaxed and feeling toasty. And even for the undergraduates, it's below the level that you would truly worry about. Not that it's risk-free, but it's not as worrisome. And just to remind you, the per se limit that defines alcohol impaired driving in 49 states, District of Columbia, is 0.08. Utah, it's 0.05. So the fact that it's dropped so significantly over the years really shows the impact of this campaign, which it's intensive, it's multifaceted, and it's a long-standing campaign. So let's turn now to the University of Virginia. And they had their campaign under the theme, The Power of Normal. And one of the things that imbues campus life there is the honor code. And so you see a message here where they presented a norm about stopping friends who have been drinking from harmless in terms of the honor code. And if you want to learn more about this particular campaign, I have the reference there for you. And you can see Wes Perkins was one of the authors. Next slide. So this campaign unfolded over time, and it became more and more elaborate over time. Starting in '99, they focused on first-year students. 3 years later, they started to have messaging that included all undergraduates. They had 2 points of focus. One is correcting misperceptions on how much and how often people were drinking. But there were also messages about these protective behaviors, and you see them listed there. So, just like Michigan State, it wasn't just the drinking over and over and over again. There were a variety of messages that all pulled in the same direction. Next slide. So they also expanded the range of communication channels that they involved. They started with what they call the Stall Street Journal, and there are 2 examples of there. Unfortunately, the images I was able to pull off the internet are a little faded or blurry. But one of the things that's important to see about that top one is, where do misperceptions come from? So one of the things that is helpful in having students believe this data is to tell them, here's the science behind why people misperceive the drinking norms, so that they'll actually believe, more likely to believe, the messaging from the campaign. And you can see they kept adding more and more elements over time, finally doing Facebook ads in 2005, as many schools started to do. They also had their small group sessions for fraternity and sorority members and athletes. They also added an annual music event, which was all about the campaign. Next slide. So in their study, they were using the National College Health Assessment Survey, and they were administering this annually for the years you see there. Now, there were no control group institutions identified, but see below, NCHA surveys are done at a number of schools. And so what they were able to do is to compare the data from University of Virginia against this collective of schools that was not doing social norms marketing. So that was their comparison. It was also important, and they say this in the article, just like they say they started using Facebook in 2005, by the way, saw the comment. There were no other new policies or programs that were launched during this period of time. So it really does increase the likelihood that any changes that you see are due to the campaign. Now let's see what those changes are in the next slide. Okay, so they asked students about a number of different consequences of drinking that they may or may not have experienced. And you can see the list there. There's a total of 10. And back in 2001, only 33% of the survey respondents said that they had not experienced any of these due to drinking. And these are all drinkers, I should emphasize. And by 2006, it's up to 51%. Experiencing multiple consequences because of their drinking, 44 of them down to 26. DUI in particular, you see the numbers there. So they also have data on student alcohol consumption. The number of ER visits that were alcohol related also went down over time. And finally, let's look at the Montana campaign. This is out of the Department of Transportation, and both Wes Perkins and Jeff Linkenbach, Wells Clayton neighbors, were part of the write-up, and you can learn more about it through that article. Let's go on to the next slide. So the focus here was drinking and driving. And you know, Montana is a sparsely populated state. I think it's fair to say that in a state like that, people were more often identify with people living in the state as a whole compared to New York or Massachusetts, where I live. Do I identify with all the residents of Massachusetts? Certainly not. So through pre-testing, they determined that simply identifying young adults statewide, the young people that they pre-tested with saw that message as being relevant. At the same time, they also, oh boy, excuse me. At the same time, they also had messaging that was regional, in some cases, county level. Next slide. One of the things I really appreciated about this study is the unique quasi-experimental design they had. So they essentially could divide the state into 3 media markets. And the counties to the west actually got the campaign. Then there was a buffer zone where there was no campaign. And then the control counties did not include the buffer, but just the states to the east. And the thinking was that people living in the eastern part of the state would very likely not be exposed to the campaign. And let's take a look at the results. Okay, so here we're looking at use of designated driver. And there are a couple of funky things going on with the data. Things never come out exactly the way you would expect. But you can see the top lines, which are actual survey participants' behavior. There's not that much difference in the first 3 surveys in self-reported designated driver use. But then in the final survey, some months after the campaign started, there's a huge drop-off in the control counties. And this underscores the importance of having comparison information whenever you can. For a study that I did many years ago, we actually saw in our experimental sites doing the campaign, the data was flat, but it was at a time when nationally, heavy episodic drinking, binge drinking, if you will, was going up. And the control group schools for that initial study also had their drinking going up. So if the only data you had in front of you was your own, and you saw no change, you might think, oh, this doesn't work. What you don't realize is that where the campaign's not in place, things are actually getting worse. And then, you can see the perceived norm. Very little difference in the beginning, and then as the messaging goes out, you can see that the percentage of respondents who state that a majority almost always have a designated driver, and it goes up. And it's interesting to see that in asking about the actual behavior, they say always. Almost always is what they said in the perceived norm. And I think they needed to do that because I think a norm about what people saying that they always use it, it just wouldn't be as credible. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is actually looking at whether they had 2 or more drinks and then started driving within an hour and had done so in the past month. And at the top, you can see the perceived norm. People think a lot of people are doing this, clearly a majority. And if you actually look at the behavior, it's quite different. So the misperception is huge. And again, in the beginning, it turned out, again, this is a quasi-experimental design, no randomization. It turned out that in the intervention counties, they were a little bit higher. And by the end of the campaign, they were lower. So those are the model campaigns. Now let's go on to final set of slides. And these are things that I'll leave for you to review later, but just quickly, lessons, you need a high level activity with frequent message repetition. Use a lot of different messages to avoid message fatigue. You have to anticipate and prepare response to counter student skepticism about the data, and have a couple of ideas for you to think about there. Next slide. Okay, so use multiple communication channels. Commuter students, I mentioned before at the University of Rhode Island, 30% of the students had never heard of our campaign. They were commuter students. So you have to think about how to reach them separate from the main student body. They have to identify with the student body as a whole, and there are things that you can do to build that, and you certainly would see that in both the Michigan State and Virginia campaigns. Next slide. Mentioned this before, there are going to be subgroup students who don't identify with the student body as a whole, and you need to have campaigns that address them. And it turns out that even within their own group, they have exaggerated perceptions of the drinking norms. So you can focus on the actual behavior. It's going to be higher than the student body as a whole, but the fact is the misperception is even higher. Next slide. So one of the things that you also need to consider is that if your campus is an alcohol-rich environment, the high density of alcohol outlets, you need to have a campaign that is especially well-funded, intensive, and multifaceted, as you have at the schools that I showed you. But you also need to engage in environmental management strategies to change the alcohol environment at the same time. And I have the paper there that talks about the study results that showed this effect of alcohol density. Next slide. Okay, another thing to consider is that there are substantial misperceptions of how many different policies students will support. And draw your attention specifically to the third one, apply stricter penalties for the use of false IDs to purchase alcohol illegally. 59.5% of the students in the survey from several schools, 18 schools, said they would support that. But only 24.2% thought that a typical student would do so. So there's that article that presents that data, and then have an article for where we actually try to use social norms campaign to set the stage for some environmental management initiatives done at the University of Rhode Island. Next slide. Okay, so this is actually a slide from Alan Berkowitz, and these are key questions that you need to ask yourself as you jump in. And one of the main things is to make sure your target audience is functioning as a real group, that they identify with the group. Next slide. Okay, so there are a whole set of issues that you need to think about as well in terms of resources and stakeholder buy-in. One of the things that we do want to caution you about is that because of the binge drinking definition that's out there, administrators can be fixed on that. And I know of a school where it was 0 to 5. A very high percentage have only 0 to 5 drinks when they party, and the president wouldn't allow the message to go out because 5 is binge drinking. Sometimes administrators are concerned that the campaign is actually endorsing alcohol use, forgetting that the perception is the students are drinking much more than they actually are. Next slide. Okay, again, you need to understand why students are skeptical and prepare in advance how you're going to address that. You saw with the University of Virginia, they had the Stall Street Journal where they went into some detail about where the misperceptions come from. That was a great strategy. Next. There are lots of ways to keep the campaign fresh, so I've listed there. We can review later. So, for, wow, that hour went fast. So, if there are additional questions, Logan, we can answer those for people who can stay with us here.
Yeah, do you want to do a couple? Bill, I know understanding that most people might have to go because it's right at 3, but if you're comfortable doing a couple questions, we'll do that, and then we'll direct people to you and with your email on the screen.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, so follow up on the questions we were talking earlier about data, and like if you don't have student data, what if thinking about national organizations, so like think fraternities and sororities, how would they go about that using kind of national data? Will members relate to the kind of the national stats?
I don't know the answer to that. It emphasizes for me the importance of pre-testing. You would have, if you have the stats from the fraternity nationwide, do some mock-up messaging that's built off of that. You know, if they have both the misperception data and what people are actually doing, and pilot test it. You know, do they identify with the national organization and all of its members, or is it campus specific? Do they believe the message and so forth? The pre-testing is so critical. So, you know, I'm doubtful of it. You know, there is a common thread to different chapters that belong to the same national fraternity, but they can be very different as well. So, you know, the proof is in the pudding, as it were.
Yeah. Next question is about, is there any information on using social norms marketing for increasing protective mental health behaviors?
I don't know for sure. I'm co-editing a book on social norms approaches, and there is an author, it's actually Wes Perkins' daughter, Jessica, who's looking at a lot of the different issues where this has this approach has been used, going beyond its origins with alcohol and tobacco. There we go. Jeff Linkenbach just said Oakland University in Michigan. So, you know, thank you, Jeff. If you can put people in touch with those folks, that would be the answer. Otherwise, Logan, if you can send me that question, I can ask Jessica Perkins very quickly what she has on that.
Yeah, I'll send it to you this afternoon.
Okay.
Last question we'll get to just for time is that you were talking about with campaign materials having a logo, you know, and is the logo of the office, you know, does it need to be leading the campaign? What are your recommendations on who that office needs to be with reception, credibility of the campaign?
Yeah. Well, if it is to be an office and that office has a logo, then I would want to make sure that it's actually viewed by students as a credible information source. At the University of Arizona, they pre-tested to find out if their office was viewed as a credible source of information, and it was. Now, it doesn't have to have a logo that refers to the office. I worked with several schools where we asked them to use the logo, just the facts. And one of the reasons that you want a logo is that it's something that every execution would include, so that they recognize more readily that this is all part of the same campaign effort.
And I lied, Bill. We'll do one more. Just looking ahead, social norms, but with graduate students, how could campaigns be kind of modified? Is there any like special things that need to be done to modify to reach this specific population? Specifically, if there's concerns with their alcohol use.
Yeah, no, I know. It is a major concern. I actually did a consultation with Harvard Business School because they were very concerned about how much drinking was going on with their first year class that year. The principles are the same. Typically the surveys that are done with undergraduates. You would have to do a survey of your graduate students, a random sample with all data de-identified and everything anonymous and so forth. So the procedure would be the same. The challenge would be finding ways to get that message to the students. And the students are going to be, it can be email messages. It can be through, if a particular graduate program has a Facebook account, the messages could come through there. They could be posters in that school's academic building. So it's just a matter really of narrow casting to that group in places where they will actually encounter the message.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bill.
Very welcome.
All right, just a few housekeeping for those, just to let you know what we have. We do have another webinar coming up on June the 14th. We have our June water cooler chat, coming up on the 13th, talking about following and monitoring trends. And our webinar is going to be talking about learning outcomes and program proposals. And then we do have our national meeting in conjunction with ARHE coming up the June the 25th through the 28th. And we hope you have enjoyed today's webinar. We are thankful that we can provide a space for people to come together and learn. And with that, we hope you have a great rest of your day and week, and take care, and hope to see you soon.